Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. Now, if you enjoyed this sort of content and this video, I would be immensely honored if you clicked the like button, and if you truly like this content, click the subscribe button. But, more importantly, let's head on to the story. The Pack, written by Glacialfury. Riker moved soundlessly through the trees and overgrown vegetation that choked the ancient railway. His tattered shirt clung to his chest and underarms in big sweaty patches, and the field stench of death and decay hung heavy in the cloying air of the forest. But Riker didn't notice. He'd long ago grown accustomed to the oppressive heat, to the foul smells, the presence of death. They were an ever-present, pervasive rot that slowly consumed the world. Here, everything was a predator. Everything was prey. His progress was slow and tedious, but necessary to avoid detection. Stealth was more important than speed. You see, speed would get you killed. He continued to work his way through bristly vines, walls of clinging underbrush, and swarms of irritating insects, to a natural alcove where a fallen tree had straddled the remains of a set of rusted-out train tracks. Beams of warm light filtered down through the thick canopy of leaves, where a group of colorful birds sang merrily. The cool air was laced with the sweet scent of honeysuckle, and a nearby brook babbled over century-slick zones as it slowly meandered through the little grove, and a pair of gleaming yellow eyes slipped silently away. Riker looked around in amazement at what he'd discovered. Even in his wildest fantasies, he'd never imagined a place such as this could exist in his desolate, hostile world. Immediately, he felt akin to a little oasis, and the tension from an endless road began to unfurl and melt away. The grove's trees were vibrant and healthy, their leaves full and robust. They came together in a natural power that acted as a barrier against the harsh elements of the outside world. He paused here for a moment to wipe the stinging sweat from his eyes and to take a refreshing drink from his canteen. A garden this lush and bountiful was a realm for the gods, truly a boon to parched travelers in a world plagued with blistering Saharan heat during the day, and raging lightning storms that spawned savage cyclones, and howling blizzards with Arctic temperatures that transformed the land into endless field of glittering ice and snow at night. Riker closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. They were exhausted, hungry, and dusk was fast approaching. He would make camp here for the night, possibly longer. Zatara, his canine companion, was diligently scouting the area in a wide circle around the fallen tree, snuffing at the ground and eyeing the dark underbrush warily. An angry mantis swatted furiously at Zatara's snout when the curious canine nosed up too closely to the tiny creature's perch. Zatara jerked his head back in wide-eyed shock and looked at Riker incredulously. Riker smiled at the big shepherd and dropped his rucksack in the dirt with a puff of dust that billowed and swirled in the broken beams of sunlight filtering through the thick canopy of trees. He flipped the pack open and dug through the contents, producing a bowl, a fire kit, and a half-dozen conies that he'd snared earlier that day. They would eat well this evening. A mosquito bit into the back of Riker's neck, sparking the man's wrath in the form of a vengeful crack that transformed the insect into a gooey red splotch on the back of his neck. Zatara's big pointy ears shot up in alarm, but quickly fell flat when Riker shrugged at the dog helplessly. "Mosquito," he muttered, holding his hand up for the dog before he flicked it away and sank down into the front of the moss-covered bog. "Scent must be wearing off." Zatara cocked his head at Riker curiously, but something in the brush caught his attention, and he quickly forgot what he was thinking about and went back to sniffing. Riker sighed, stretching his aching muscles, and began the long, mundane task of setting up camp. First was camp security, so Riker moved about the grove, concealing sinister traps and snares around its perimeter. A tedious task, but better than something nasty sneaking up on them while they slept. When he was finished, Riker erected a spark-proof canvas designed to neutralize smoke by binding the particles to its surface, essential for keeping their location hidden. Next was the fire itself, which Riker stacked and stoked inside a ring of stones until it roared mightily beneath the leafy ceiling. Riker stepped back and admired his work. Not a single black mote escaped the green clutches of the canvas trap. He smiled with approval. It worked. Their little sanctuary would be safe from the hungry eyes of prowling predators. Now that he'd done all he could to secure their little hideout, it was time to see about dinner. While he prepared the conies for the flame, his mind drifted back to his studies of the ancients. They didn't need fire to cook their meals. Everything was done for them with a mysterious device inside their fortress of steel. The ancients never knew hunger or thirst or disease. They conquered them all, even death itself, for a time. However, as the centuries rolled slowly by, the ancients grew increasingly bold and reckless, arrogant to the point of blindness. Drunk on their own power and full of insolence, they believed their might sufficient to challenge the gods, and they reached for the stars. But the gods grew angry with the ancients, and in a moment of divine wrath, destroyed them, and cast their ruin across the land. But the ancients didn't go quietly into the abyss. They had one final trick up their sleeve. On the eve of their destruction, the ancients used a secret weapon so powerful it annihilated the gods in a blinding flash of retribution, and transformed the land into a sea of glittering black glass. An arcane device so destructive, it was forbidden to ever be used. A cold horror crept over Riker as he visualized such a weapon. The realization that mankind had once wielded such power was terrifying. Riker blinked and shook off the reverie. He leaned in close to examine the sizzling conies as tiny droplets of fat hissed on the fire's scarlet embers, still not ready. He sat back and watched the flickering shadows dance along the tree line as the crimson sun painted vivid pastels across the sky. The conies were beginning to turn golden brown with a hint of char to add that delicious, slightly burnt taste to the flavor of the meat. Riker eyed them avaricously. It had been weeks since they'd eaten this well. The smell alone was torture enough to drive a man insane, since the companions had grown shaky and weak from a diet of insects and grass, mainly grass. Zatara finished skulking about and appeared satisfied that nothing lurked in the darkened woods. With a final huff, he padded over to where Riker reclined by the fire to drool and stare. The tantalizing scent of roasting rabbit had the dog's mouth oozing shoestrings of slobber that stretched towards the ground. "Food!" Riker grunted and absently scratched behind Zatara's ears while jabbing at the softly snapping logs. His stomach grumbled its solidarity with Zatara. Riker glanced at Zatara, then back at the conies. Maybe just this once, he mused. What could it hurt? One little taste, that's all. Riker was reaching for the rabbits when Zatara's high-pitched bark snapped him out of his trance. He blinked in horror as his hands hovering above the partially cooked rabbits. Riker snatched it back and wedged it fully under his leg. More than one man had gambled on undercooked meat and paid a terrible price. No matter how hungry they were or how long the road, everything had to be fully cooked every time without exception. Even fruits and veggies. If Riker ever failed in this task, even once, he risked the parasites taking him, a fate worse than death. The elders taught that the scourge was a curse cast upon the ancients by dying gods, a final revenge from the abyss. Riker didn't know if that was true, but he did know that nothing was safe. He'd seen the vacant stares of those afflicted with the scourge. They became mindless husks that savagely attacked anything unlucky enough to wander into their path. Even the flesh of the few remaining plants and animals hardy enough or stubborn enough to avoid extinction was tainted. Not yet, but soon, Riker replied softly, more to quell his raging stomach than to appease Zatara. You know the drill. Zatara groaned mournfully and dropped his big head between his paws to wait out the agonizing eternity until the conies were ready. Riker popped his rifle against the fallen tree and gazed up at the ghostly shapes moving around in the branches. They spun and twisted mischievously. The fire snapped softly and the crickets chirped. The shadows took form. Their sway was hypnotic. Join us, they whispered cryptically before dancing away. Riker watched them curiously. Join us, the shadows repeated, more insistent this time, their voices taking on a sinister edge. Join us! Suddenly, the shadows deepened and icy white fingers reached down from the branches. Riker woke with a start. He blinked and blinked again, but nothing was there. No icy fingers stretching down from the shadows to claim Riker's soul. Just the leaves rustling in the frigid wind. Riker rubbed his eyes and yawned, just a trick of the shadows. Riker glanced at Zatara, who was curled up next to him with his fur soaking up the fire, snoring determinedly. Riker shook his head and leaned in once more to check on the conies. A sigh of relief escaped his lips. He reached out and gently nudged the snoring Zatara, who grudgingly cracked a bloodshot eye. What? Riker smiled broadly and held up the conies. Dinner, he said casually, pointing a thumb at the spit of crispy streaming conies, still sizzling from the fire pit. Or are you going to skip dinner? Zatara frantically scrambled to his feet. Never! After gorging themselves past the point of contentment, Riker stretched out by the fire with Zatara flopped next to him. He absently pulled the thick, wiry hair covering his face while fumbling around the rucksack for one of his more prized possessions. Riker smiled reverently when his hand finally closed around the object and carefully withdrew it from his rucksack. He gently placed the stained rag on his thigh and began to unwrap it. What he revealed was a silvery egg-shaped mirror that gleamed orange in the fire's glow. He ran a grimy thumb over the priceless artifact. If the chiefs ever found out he possessed a mirror, they would hunt him to the edges of Earth to pry it from his cold, dead hands. Riker never used it in the presence of other people. Humans killed for much less than a perfect mirror, sometimes just for fun. He once saw a son murder his father over a half a potato, his father's life before half a tuber. Madness. Riker glanced in the mirror and examined his wind-burned face. His violet eyes, ringed in dark circles and sunk slightly in his face, stared back at him. A coarse black beard covered a face cold with horrors of the past, and a hideous purple scar cut a jagged path across his face. He ran a hand through an equally dark mane of hair and briefly considered a shave and a cut before dismissing the thought entirely. In a world where the magic of antibiotics and antiseptics were just ancient fairy tales, a simple shaving cut could be deadly. It wasn't worth the risk. He carefully rewrapped the mirror and slid it back into his rucksack before slowly drifting into a tranquil slumber, no longer wary of ghostly fingers. Something was wrong. He willed himself to wake, but the darkness clung to him, fought hard to put him back. He struggled against it, but the darkness persisted. He fought harder, but he was strong. He raged against it, pounding and pounding until nothing remained. Cognizance flickered painfully close, taunting him so close. He strained towards it with every ounce of his being. Muscles pulled taut with the effort, face a rictus mask. Consciousness crashed home like a splash of icy water, and Riker's eyes flew open. Zatara stood over him, heckles up, growling. A ghostly white moon glimmered brightly above the trees, bathing the landscape in a cold, silvery light. And the stars glittered like a million diamonds in the empty blackness. Danger! Riker hauled himself up and looked around warily. But nothing was there. Just the cold remains of dinner stacked neatly by the stones of their dwindling fire. A fire that was now burning dangerously low. Riker quickly tossed a few logs on the fire and stoked the flames until their brilliance burned away the light. It was then that he realized what was different. It was the crickets. They were silent. He looked around slowly, his spine tingling. There was an otherworldly stillness in the air. A log shifted in the fire, throwing up a shower of sparks, and an owl called out to the night with a flutter of deadly wings. They were the only sounds in the deafening silence. Suddenly, Zatara's growl deepened, a deep, throaty rumble that warned Riker of imminent danger. Riker snatched up his rifle and sprang to his feet, swiveling in a series of short spinning hops to cover all areas of the camp at once. His breath came in rapid, shallow gasps and panted quietly in his ears, but nothing was there. Where is it? Riker thought at Zatara. I don't see anything. That's because your human eyes deceive you, Riker. Use your nose, your ears. They are out there. I can smell their fell stench of the wind. Riker's sharp reply was cut short by a bone-chilling scream that pierced the night, sending prickles of fear rippling down his spine. His heart jumped against his ribs. Adrenaline scorched his veins. Don't run! Don't run! You'll just die tired, Riker told himself repeatedly and stoically braced for whatever was coming. The numbing scream tore through the night once more, this time closer, more familiar. Riker recognized it as the scream of a dying human. The shocking revelation rocked Riker back on his heels, and Zatara whimpered with confusion. Riker took a step back. This wasn't his fight. He should just turn and melt into the trees, leave them to their fate. But something held him in place. Morbid curiosity, perhaps. He had to know what was happening out there. Something about the blood-curdling scream stoked a primal instinct in Riker that burned brightly. Charging into dangerous situations wasn't something Riker did willingly, but instinct drove him into the woods. His chest was pounding, his eyes were wide, demons skulked in every tree. But he beat back his terror and continued to put one foot in front of the other. He was barely aware of Zatara's presence in his mind. The shepherd's voice had diminished to a tiny spark drowned out by the roaring hurricane in Riker's ears. Why was he still moving towards the screams? They were probably dead already. No reason to check, right? He was still wrestling with that question when Zatara's teeth clamped down on his ankle, holding him fast. What the hell, Zatara? Zatara's ears twitched with annoyance. How humans ever dominated this planet will forever remain a mystery. Zatara grumbled at Riker. You're lucky their senses are worse than your own, or they would have heard you stumbling about. Riker dropped into a defensive crouch and crept forward with his rifle leading. They are just ahead. Use my senses. We are pack. Riker hesitated. He wasn't sure what Zatara meant. What do you mean? He asked, confused. You've built a barrier between our minds, closed yourself off, Zatara explained, inching along the ground in a low crouch next to Riker. Pull down the wall. We are pack. We should fight like one. Riker had always been aware, on some level, that he was keeping Zatara's mind at arm's length from his own. The thought of melding minds with an animal had repulsed him. But Zatara was right. They were pack. He should act like it. But he wasn't sure how to take the barrier down. He hadn't consciously constructed it. So he clumsily slid his mind around the surface of the barrier, like fingers across a brick and mortar, probing for a crack. Riker's heart swelled with hope when he found a weak spot in the barrier, but quickly sank when it slipped through his mind's fingers like sand in an hourglass. He tried to stop it, tightening his grip to crushing force, but the harder he closed his mind around it, the faster it slipped away. Riker cursed in frustration and redoubled his efforts, perspiration streaming down his knotted forehead. He was concentrating fully on the barrier when something powerful blew past Zatara and crashed into him, sending Riker cartwheeling through the trees. Riker slid to a stop against the rough bark of an oak, with his vision swimming in flickering black spots. He tried to stand, but dizziness sent him stumbling face first into another tree. Before he could rise again, huge grey hands closed around his neck, cutting off his airway. Riker's eyes bulged red from their sockets as he flailed ineffectively at the huge hands squeezing the life from him. The strength in those hands was frightening, irresistible. The black motes began to multiply as darkness swirled around his vision. Riker pounded frantically on the creature's arms and face, but it had no effect. He tried to look for a weapon, anything, but he couldn't turn his head in that iron grip. He groped around desperately for anything that he could get his hands on and felt his thumb slide over something wet and bulbous. Riker crushed and twisted and fought with the feral strength of a man fighting for his life. He heard Zatara snarling and clawing and tearing somewhere in the distance. He tried to focus on it, but his mind was so foggy, so tired. Zatara frenzied attacks jarred the beast's grip loose, and its thumb pushed inside Riker's mouth. Riker bit it off. The creature howled in agony and tore its hand away from the terrible human. Zatara flew into a rampage, clamping his powerful jaws on the back of the creature's neck and whipping about furiously. Riker gagged and retched on the creature's acrid blood and spit the revolting digit into the dirt. He drank in deep, ragged lungfuls of air that cooled his burning lungs. Strength slowly returned to his limbs, and he staggered to his feet. With his vision now clear, he peered closely at the hideous creature. It was an Irgax. Irgax are hulking bipedal creatures that tower a head taller than most men and are twice as ugly, with thick, mottled grey skin covered in countless wart-like growths. They possess superhuman strength, but move like a tortoise. Riker didn't know much else about the Urgax, except that the legends say that they were once foot soldiers of the gods. Now they were nothing more than mindless, evil beasts that hunt their favorite game, humans, in bloodthirsty packs. The thought of these foul beasts feasting on human flesh sent Riker's lips twitching into a snarl. He kicked the Urgax in the throat and quickly searched around for his rifle as Zatara tore the creature down. But the Urgax wasn't alone. Its friends were calling out to it in their harsh, broken language. When the Urgax didn't respond, its comrades lumbered into the bush after it. The Urgax managed to stagger to its feet, with Zatara dangling from its neck, snarling and ripping away savagely. Blue blood poured from dozens of gaping gashes and wounds that crisscrossed the Urgax's body. It bellowed in pain and groped after Zatara while stupidly spinning in a circle. Riker finally spotted the rifle as the enraged Urgax swung around with its crimson eyes boring into him and a huge grey fist rocketing at his head. Riker dove for his rifle and tucked into a roll as his hands closed on its grip. He spun around and came up shooting, his rifle's rapid cracks punching huge holes into the creature's chest. The Urgax jerked and stumbled backwards with every round, and its arms dropped lifelessly to its sides and lolled about. Riker put 2 rounds between its 4 crimson eyes for good measure. The remaining Urgax, having witnessed the power of Riker's rifle, spun about and quickly retreated into the trees. Zatara sprang after them, but Riker stopped him short. Let them go. Zatara pulled up in a surprise, and his head whipped around. We should run them down and tear out their throats. Another time, perhaps, Riker replied, pointing to the tree where they had disappeared. There could be more of them out there, waiting. A trap? Possibly, he replied, this time absently. His thoughts had slipped back into the people on the initial Urgax assault. Either way, they won't be back. How can you be sure? Zatara wanted to know as Riker made his way over to the clearing where the humans had battled the Urgax. Are they that cowardly? Riker looked back at Zatara and grinned with all his teeth. After witnessing the might of my companion, they would be fools to return. Zatara sat back on his haunches, with his tongue lolling out of his self-satisfied grin. You pander well, human. There was nothing left alive in the clearing, just the torn and bloody remains of 5 shattered humans and their meager belongings. Upon closer inspection, Riker determined by the looks of their handmade clothing and few possessions, they were more likely a band of traveling nomads. Riker scuffed about the scene idly, kicking at random objects, looking for anything useful. He tore open bags and rifled through pockets, but in the end, he wasn't able to scavenge much. Just a few bags of dried rations, 2 vials of medicine, and to his surprise, a large box of ammunition for his rifle. Bullets are a precious, rare commodity used in trading, worth 100 times their weight in gold. Now, he was certain that they were nomads on their way to trade. He briefly considered burying the bodies, but ultimately decided against it. They were no kin of his, and besides, he really didn't have the luxury of sticking around to see to it. Riker turned to leave when Zatara's words froze him fast. What of the human cub? Riker whirled around in shock. What are you talking about? He demanded gruffly, glancing all around the camp. There was no child here, only the corpses of 5 adults. If this was Zatara's idea of a joke, it was in the poorest of taste. Riker's impotent rage rose up. Is this a joke to you? Zatara's ears flattened with a sharp rebuke. Angry, the cub is over there. Zatara looked to a cluster of ferns that swayed gently between the wide trunks of 2 mighty oaks. Can you not smell the child? Hear it crying? Riker hurried over to the ferns and jerked them wide. What he saw stunned him. A purple-faced baby bundled in a brown stained blanket with dirty rags stuffed in its mouth, the tears streaming its cheeks, stared up at him helplessly. He pulled the suffocating cloth from the baby's mouth, but regretted it immediately. The screams that tore forth from its tiny lungs were unbelievable. Riker seriously considered stuffing the rag back in place, but Zatara cautioned against it. He didn't know anything about babies or why it was crying. He just wanted it to shut up before it brought the entire forest down on their heads. He tried clamping a hand over its mouth, but that only made the matters worse. He picked it up, but that didn't help either. After 10 minutes of unbroken screaming, he questioned why anyone would want one of these things. What the hell were they thinking? What he really wanted to do was toss the shrieking bag of rags into the forest and be on his way. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. Riker set the baby down and looked at Zatara, who was also completely clueless on what to do. "We should take the cub with us," the shepherd suggested. "It is packless." Riker wasn't sure he wanted the responsibility of caring for a baby. The child was annoying as shit, and definitely was not part of their pack. He turned to leave. But then, something unexpected happened. The child stopped crying. Zatara's ears shut up in surprise at the sudden absence of noise. Riker gripped his rifle tighter and glanced back over his shoulder. The baby regarded him with innocent eyes that glittered with 1,000 tiny facets. It cooed softly at him and reached out with a plump little hand that said, "Please take me with you. I'm a baby. I can't defend myself." Riker was smiling like a fool and didn't even know it. Zatara stared at him with her head cocked to the side. "We keep." Riker blinked and quickly wiped a stupid grin from his face. He had no idea why he was smiling or what the hell was happening to him. The baby laughed a soft, sweet melody that melted the ice around Riker's heart. Zatara trotted over to the newest member of their pack and laid down protectively beside her. After a long moment of hesitation, Riker joined him beside the child. In that moment, standing in the middle of the blood-soaked battlefield, in the frigid darkness of the forest, that a canine taught a man how to be human again. End of story. I'd quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Bushmaster 177, Henry the Red, Caspar Arnholtz, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Elijah Silvercross, Dragzoon WRE, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.